Hello everyone and welcome to this UnitedPOP 3D Designer recording. This is something new that I'm doing. There was a certain demand from some of the students in the class to have some reference material to take a look at home so they could better practice in modeling in Maya 2022. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to take a look at how to set up a new project in Maya and how to get started modeling in Maya. So I hope you enjoy this recording and let's get started. Before we actually take a look at Maya, I want to quickly go over what we discussed in the previous class, which is this idea of a 3D pipeline. Now, for those of you who don't know, basically what a pipeline is a defined set of steps that a 3D modeler takes in order to get from a concept or an idea to a finished 3D asset for in a game or in an animation or something like that. Now, this is something that I've sort of loosely defined in this slide right here. Um, and what I wanted to focus on was these three in the middle that are the most important things that we're going to be discussing in the 3D designer course. So, like I said, um, each one of these steps can be part of a pipeline, but we're going to be focusing mostly on finding reference, doing some pre-production, which is what we're going to be doing first, and finally producing some cool models in 3D in Maya. So each one of these steps can be subdivided in smaller steps, and when you're talking about a big project or AAA game, there's usually hundreds or thousands of steps. But this is just sort of the gist of it, and I wanted to show this to give you guys an impression of what it is that we're actually going to be doing. So reference then. What we're going to be looking at today is how to create something like this, which is sort of like a retro 3D toy robot. Maybe you've had one when you were a kid, maybe you've seen them in a shop somewhere. I think they're still being made, sort of as like a nostalgia piece. But yeah, this is just something that we're going to be trying to create ourselves in order to get more familiar with the software. Now, I encourage anyone to sort of do their own research as well. I took the liberty to just find some pictures in order to get you started, but you don't necessarily have to do something as basic as this, which is just a couple of cubes really stacked on top of each other in the shape of a man. There are other cool designs out there as well, which are more rounded or conical in shape. And if you have the time and if you really like what you're doing, you can also uh, take an extra step and just add something like this, which is a fun attribute, little marching drum or something like that. If you plan on animating it when you're done, that could be fun as well. So that's again really quickly the reference part. If you're going to be doing this more often, there are more steps to just finding some pictures online. For instance, there is also a great website called ArtStation where a lot of digital artists show off their artwork, and you can do a search there and find some 3D models, for instance, to take a look at, which can also be very useful. But I might do a separate video on finding good reference later on. For now, let's jump into Maya and let's get started creating our project. You may be hearing me take a sip of water every now and again because I'm talking a lot. So before we start modeling, the first thing we want to do is set up our workspace and our file structure, which is important because whenever we're working on something and we we close it off and we save it, we want to make sure that we sort of not only save our progress but also save what we were working on. So at one point you might be modeling. At one point, you might be animating. You might install some third-party scripts to help you. You might change the UI a little bit, and we don't want to have to reopen all of those things and reinstall all of those things every time that we open our project. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the top left of our screen right here. By the way, I have a very wide resolution, so I'm not entirely sure how this is going to be how this will translate to YouTube and to a regular video. I hope the symbols and the text isn't going to be too small. If it is, I'll make sure that in the next video I set it up differently so you guys have a better view of what I'm doing. But anyway, we're going to go to the top left of our screen and click File. And then we're going to go down to where it says Set Project. Um, Now I'm Dutch. I have my window set up in Dutch, so these are all Dutch words, so don't be alarmed if none of this makes any sense. We're just going to create a new folder for our file, for our project file. So in this case, I'm going to be just creating a new folder on my desktop, and I'm going to be naming it Toy Robot. Robot. There we go. And then I'm going to double click it and I'm going to say select, and then Maya is going to ask me where I want to place my workspace file, and in this case I just want to keep it within the project folder, so I'm just going to click create default workspace. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to set up a file structure, because whenever you're working in 3D you always, more often than not, you're working with multiple files and multiple different files as well. So in order to keep everything organized, we're gonna set a default file structure that we can use in order to make sure that we can always find what we're looking for. So we're gonna do that by going to again to the top of the screen to Windows, and then it says right there Workspaces, and then we're gonna go to um, set current workspace as. No, that's not what I meant. We're gonna go to I apologize, I was looking at the wrong thing. We're gonna go to File where it says Project Window, and then we're gonna see that we have all these default folders that we can create. And up here we can check whether it's in the right uh, project folder. So we have our current project, Toy Robot, and then our current project file on the desktop. So once we have that, we're just going to click Accept. And now when we go to our folder in the desktop, we should be able to see, let me look it up real quick, Toy Robot, there we go. We should be able to see that we have all these default folders right here that we can use. And then the last thing we want to do is we want to set up an autosave so that whenever something goes wrong, our file gets corrupted or our project crashes, we can always go to our latest autosave and just start again from there. And we're going to do that by going to Windows and then Settings and Preferences, and we're going to click Preferences. And then if we scroll down, we should be able to see under Settings a tab with Files and Projects right there. And then you should see a tab that says Autosave. And you can click Enable and then also set the interval for the amount of minutes that you want between each autosave. I have it set to 20 minutes. I actually might change it to 15 minutes real quick. And then click Save. So let's get started modeling. So we know that we want to create a toy robot. I think I'm just going to go for the classic shape that we looked at. So you guys can just follow along, or you can try something else whenever you're done. But for now, I think it's easiest to just go along with creating a classic toy robot. So I'm going to start out by drawing a cube. By the way, I should probably show you this as well. Um, the default way of creating cubes in Maya works a bit differently than what you just saw. Whenever you click one of these primitives on the top, you'll just see a primitive appear in the middle of your scene, and half of it probably sticking through the ground plane right here. I don't like that, so I have to set it up differently. You can do that as well if you feel like that's something you want to do. And you can do that by going to Create, and then where it says polygon primitives, if you go all the way to the down to the bottom, it should say interactive creation right here. And when you check that box, you should be able to do it like I just did. And then one other thing that might be worth covering as well is you see that whenever I zoom out, I get these little black artifacts, these sort of frailing artifacts on the side of my cube right here. And when I zoom out, you'll see my ground plane disappearing as well, which can be a bit annoying. So we're going to fix that real quick. And by the way, this is probably caused by um, the way you have your units set up in Maya. So you can tell Maya to use different types of units. For instance, one Maya unit could be equal to 1 centimeter or 1 meter or even more. And this can sort of mess with your cameras a little bit. So maybe you don't have this at all, but in case you do, you can just go to your outliner right here, which is the little window that we have in where we can see all of our current objects in the scene. And when you click the perspective camera, you should be able to get some attributes that you can change. And I'll I'll cover that immediately as well. Uh, on the so you saw on the left side and on the right side we have different windows. Like I said, on the left side we have our outliner, which helps us sort of organize our entire scene. And on the right side we actually have three different tabs, which I'm going to go over. The first one is called the channel box and the layer editor, um, which is used to basically change any perimeters of the thing that we have selected. So for instance, I have my cube selected and there's all these perimeters that I can change. We'll get back to that later. The first thing I want to do is fix my camera. So I'm gonna deselect my cube real quick and I'm gonna select my perspective camera, and now you can see in this other tab on the right called the attribute editor that we have our camera selected with all of its attributes. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the near clip plane, and I'm just going to set that to 0.1. There we go. That should get rid of those artifacts. And then I'm also going to increase my far clip plane like that. And this just makes sure that the camera takes into account the current unit setup that we have. So uh, let's stay on this side of the program for now. As you can see, I have these three different tabs right here. And the first one, like I said, is called the channel box. And whenever you select anything in Maya, when it's a primitive, for instance, like this cube, you should be able to get a couple of attributes right here. And the first one is called Pt1. Now, it's a bit of a strange name, but there's a good reason for that actually. And I'll show you it real quick. Because when we go up to Windows again, and we select the node editor, you should be able to see something like this, where it says pcube1. Now, what is this? So one important thing to understand about Maya is that Maya is a node-based program, which means that everything you do in Maya, whether it's creating a new primitive like this or um, creating a new set of extrusions on your model or doing anything to your geometry, it stores it as a node that looks like this. And let me actually click this button real quick. Um, Now you can see all the nodes that are used to draw this box with its current attributes. So we have our polycube1, which actually is the what we call the creation node, which defines how big it is, so the width, the height, and the depth of our box. Then we have our p-cube shape, which is basically a node that tells the program that we need to draw uh, a box, we need to render a box. And then we also have our initial shading group, which isn't really important for now. That's just needed to make it visible. And then lastly, we have our pcube1, which is our transform node, which makes sure that we can move it around and stuff like that. So the reason I'm telling you this is because if you start modeling, you might see a lot of different tabs like these open up. And these are all your nodes. When I started out modeling in Maya, this was very confusing to me. Like, why do they have all these tabs right here? And it would seemingly stretch out endlessly. And then I watched some tutorials and I understood, oh, wait a minute, those are all the nodes that are corresponding to my current selection. And it's a very powerful way of working. It can be very handy, especially when you need to change something that you worked on, hours ago, and you want to change something about a certain aspect that you changed of your model. Then it can be very handy. But most of all, we want to try to get rid of all these nodes every now and again because they can also corrupt your file and they can make your entire software crash. So I'll show you how to do that in a minute. For now, though, let's get back to the channel box on the right, and let's click our polycube 1, and let's define a width and a height and a depth for this cube, which is going to be our main body. So I like to round off these numbers. Um, it's not that important, but I like to do it because whenever you're working on geometry, sometimes it can be handy to sort of be able to divide it down the middle, or down a third or a fourth. And when they're rounded off numbers, that can be a bit easier to do in your head instead of having to mess around with very small increments. And let's make the depth let's make it 2 is probably fine. Actually, I want to make it a bit narrower. And let's make it a bit wider as well. There we go. So that's going to be the torso of our robot, even though it looks just like a cube. um, And then because this is going to be our torso, and because I want to have my torso symmetrical, I'm also going to make sure that it is aligned on my grid better. So again, you can see this is one of those nodes that we just took a look at, and it has all these attributes that we can change. And in this case, I'm just going to change the translation of it on the grid so it's perfectly centered. Okay, so now let's continue by giving our robot some limbs. So I'm going to start out by drawing another box and just sort of creating an arm like that. And then I'm going to create another box that's going to be his legs. And again, if you're not using interactive creation like I am, you can just create a new primitive and then start adjusting it in the channel box right here where it says polycube. You can see it's also numbering our polycube. So this is polycube 1, this is polycube 2, this is polycube 3. And I'm gonna round off these numbers as well. So let's make this 0.7 and the height 7 and the depth, let's make that 0.6 is good. There we go. I'm gonna do the same for my leg real quick. And what we're doing right now, this is usually what they call the blockout phase, which means that you're not really modeling yet. You're just placing all the primitives that you need in order to get started, and in order um, to to get an idea of what it is that you need and how much of each thing you need. So in this case, we want to have 4 limbs and a head and a torso and all that stuff. Um, I actually think I want to make this a cylinder. It should be fun. There we go. And we can change the amount of subdivisions that it has. In this case, the subdivisions mean the amount of polygons that are used to make its entire circumference. So for instance, if I change this to 4, it becomes basically another uh, rectangle, another square. But I think I'm gonna go for 16 maybe. Yeah, 16 is good. Okay, so that's going to be our leg. I'm gonna adjust the radius a little bit, the height as well. That's good. And then we also want to create a head for our little robot guy. There we go. Bit of a tall head. That would actually be fun to have him sort of give him like a strange posture like this. I'm not going to do that now though. Cool idea for another time. Let's see here. So again, I'm going to change this up a little bit. It's a bit tall. Um, let's make it 2.5. Let's make the width 3. And then I also want to make sure that this is centered on my x-axis. So you can always sort of see on your ground plane, you have these two sort of thicker lines, which represent the x and the z-axis in this case. Um, there's also a y-axis, of course, but that would mean that there would also have to be a black line just going up from the ground like this, and that would look a bit weird. I'm sure you can enable it somewhere though, if you really want that, but I don't know where. Um, so you might have to look that up. So I'm gonna put this on 0 on the x-axis and 0 on the z-axis. And I also want to make sure my limbs are zeroed on the z-axis as well. So, and again, this is all just so we can basically mirror everything that we do later on, which saves us a lot of time. So, well, that doesn't really look like a robot yet. I'm actually going to give him a pair of feet as well. All right, that's not what I wanted. Damn it. Just delete that. There we go. That is supposed to be his foot for now. So, oh, I deleted his head. Can't have a robot without a head. Okay, so that's our robot. Okay, so now that we have sort of blocked out our guy, let's start adding some geometry to make him a little bit more interesting. And I think I'm going to start out by drawing a cylinder, uh, which I'm going to use to make his shoulder joint. Whoops. Now, I've created a Maya cheat sheet for all the students, which you can refer to get an insight of all the shortcuts that you can use, like the most used shortcuts. I will try to name them as I'm modeling as well, but my modeling usually uh, is a lot faster than my thoughts and my speech because it's sort of muscle memory. But I'll try to call out whenever I use a certain shortcut uh, so you can go along with what I'm doing. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to rotate this shoulder joint to be facing like that because his arm needs to rotate like that eventually. And I'm switching between the move tool, the rotate tool, and the scale tool a lot, which is W for the move tool, E for the rotate tool, and R for the scale tool. So I'm gonna rotate his shoulder. But one of the things you'll notice is that when I drag on one of these axes. So again, the sort of circles that you see on the rotate tool correspond to the same axis as on the move tool. So in this case, I want to rotate it along the what would that be? The Y axis, I think. No, the Z. I apologize. The Z axis. Um, I'm dragging on the Y to rotate it on the Z. It can be a bit counterintuitive every now and again. But it does it in like this smooth way, and I don't want that because I want it to be precisely turned 90 degrees. So one way we can do that is again we can go up to the channel box right here and just rotate it a bit and then see what we changed and then say I want to have it rotated 90 degrees. But I don't want to be going over there all the time changing little numbers in the channel box. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down J and then I'm going to rotate my cylinder and you'll see that it snaps in increments of 15 degrees. And that can be really useful because a lot of times you just want to rotate something 180 or 90 degrees or 45 degrees, in which case that snap rotate can be really useful. So again, E for the rotate tool and then holding down J in order to snap it. So now that I've done that, I'm just going to move it over here. So it's going to be a shoulder, and I think I may want to reduce the subdivisions a little bit. Let's make it 16 as well. Yeah, 16 is good. And I want to increase the radius a little bit, radius of 1, and I want to adjust the height by, let's make it 0.8. Actually, no, let's just make it 1 as well. A nice chunky shoulder. And again, I'm gonna just center this on my z-axis real quick. There we go. So one thing you might notice is that at one point things become a bit difficult to differentiate when you start clipping geometry into each other. Uh, and one way we can sort of help ourselves is by going to the top of our viewport. What we're looking at is called our viewport. And click this little cube right here, the blue cube with the white stripes. When we click that, you'll see that our edges get highlighted, so it makes it a bit easier for us to see what we're doing. And then if you want to, you could also, for instance, enable this option right here, the little sphere with the blue plane beneath it. And when you do that, it actually adds some shading characteristics to our model, uh, which look nice, I guess. Uh, I like to have it turned on, but some people don't. Anyway, so you can do that as well. Um, okay, so now we have a shoulder joint, uh, and I think what I want to do is I want to have a little bend in my arm. So he will have a forearm that sort of faces forward a little bit. And what I'm going to do to achieve that is first I'm going to reduce the height of my rectangle here. Um, One thing you'll notice as well, that whenever you hover over one of these numbers in the channel box, a little icon appears where your cursor gets split into two arrows that point in opposite directions. Whenever you see that, you can start dragging to change the value, which can be useful. But as you can see, it's uh, pretty drastic. It takes pretty big steps. So one thing we can do is when we hold down Control and then drag on one of these values, it should give us a bit finer control over how much increments we get with each step. The size of the increments, I should probably say. So now we sort of have an upper arm, and I think I wanna have this taper a little bit. So the next thing we're going to get into is what we call marking menus. And marking menus are great because they're basically shortcuts for pretty much everything that you want to do in Maya. And in this case, because I want to start editing the geometry of this cube right here, I want to be able to select a single face. In this case, the bottom face of this cube. Now, marking menus, we're going to go over the different types of marking menus as we go along. So for now, I'm just going to show you one, and then we'll get to the other ones whenever we need them. So I want to select a single face. If I hold down Shift and then hold down my left mouse button, no, I apologize. I got confused for a second. If I hold down Control and then hold down my right mouse button, I can select a couple of different things in this marking menu, and these are called the components of a polygon basically. So a polygon is built up of edges, vertices, and faces. And so for instance, if I want to select just one face, I can hover over face and let go. And now you can see that my selection changes. So instead of selecting the entire box, I can now select a single face. And now I can, for instance, go back to my scaling tool and start scaling down this face a little bit so we get this nice taper in our upper arm like that. So that's our upper arm. Let's continue and give this guy an elbow. Um, Now, one of the things I want to show real quick right now is that uh, thus far we've just been creating new primitives every time that we want to add some more geometry to our model. But we don't have to do that always because, for instance, right now I have this shoulder joint and it could very well just as easily be an elbow joint as well. I just need to make it a little bit smaller. So instead of going through the whole process of creating a new primitive, I'm just going to hold down the shift button and I'm going to drag down. And as you'll see, it creates a copy of the current of the object that I had selected. And I can keep doing this. I can keep creating new copies, etc., etc. So by by doing this, we can just sort of speed up our workflow a little bit. But one thing you'll notice as well, if I do Control Z real quick to undo my last operation, is that whenever we create a copy, keep an eye on our nodes that our active nodes that we have on this object right here. If I create a copy, one of them disappears. And the reason this happens is because we're not creating a new primitive. And whenever we create a new primitive, Maya gives us the option to to change some parameters, change the radius, the size, whatever. But when we create a copy of a primitive, we basically tell Maya, hey, we just want to have some more geometry that looks like this. So what Maya does is it bakes the current node into the new copy. And all this means is that it basically gets rid of that node and it makes sure that the history, so to speak, gets committed so that we no longer have that node and we basically have a blank, uh, blank new model, blank new primitive. Um, so just keep that in mind that whenever we do this, we get a copy, but we can no longer adjust the attributes of that node that we had in the original. So if we want to now, for instance, give this or rescale this, we have to select the scale tool with R, and when we can scale it down like this to get it to where we want to have it. Now, one thing you'll notice as well is that within our gizmos, our move gizmo and our scale gizmo, we have these little squares right here, which can come which can come in useful because they allow you to adjust the scale in this case across two axes. So whenever we grab one handle, we scale it over one axis, and whenever we grab the middle one, we scale the entire thing. But we can also scale along two axes, which is really useful in our case because we want to keep the width of these joints to sort of keep continuity within our model, but we want to have a smaller circumference. So we're just gonna use that to scale it down. Um, and the move tool, it's the same deal except with moving it around. So if you want to move it around across two axes without uh, making any changes to it in 3D, so to speak, we can just grab one of those squares and drag it around like that. Okay. Um, Yeah, I have to say out loud everything that I'm thinking, so it can be a bit maybe a bit chaotic every now and again, but I just gonna try to cover everything that I can as I'm doing it. So now the same thing that we just did for our shoulder joint, let's do that for our lower arm as well. So we're gonna select our upper arm right here, and we're gonna hold down Shift and just drag it down like that. And now all we have to do is rotate a little bit. Again, let's hold down J so we can snap rotate it like that. And now we move it into position. And of course, it's a little bit big, so let's grab our scale tool again. Now, one thing you'll notice as well is that when we rotated our upper arm right here that we copied, um, the scale tool uh, sort of changed orientation with the object, which is really useful because now we can just scale it down like that. But our move tool didn't. So why is that? Well, the reason Maya does that is because usually when you're scaling something, you want to preserve the original orientation of that object when you created it. But for moving, it's much more intuitive to have it always on the same three axes because that's how we think in real life as well. When we're moving around something, we think in the same three axes. We're not gonna say, oh, we have to move it diagonally up that way and then diagonally that way. However, we can change this if we want to, which can be really useful. And I'm going to show you how to do that with another marking menu. So we have our shortcuts for our, whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. We have our shortcuts for our different tools, our move tool, our uh, rotate tool, and our scale tool, W, E, and R. But when we hold down, for instance, W, and then we hold down our left mouse button, apology, um, then we get another marking menu. And this marking menu is there to change some of the options of our current selected tool. And to the left here, you'll see that we have two different boxes that we can select. One says world and one says object. Now, when I hover over object and let go, you'll see that our move tool changed as well in the same way that our scale tool did. And that's because I've changed the move tool to uh, keep oriented to the local axis. So one thing you have to keep in mind is that there are different what they call spaces that you work with within Maya and pretty much any 3D program. One is world space and the other is local space or object space, which basically means that this cube, for instance, this forearm that we have, it exists in the world with along with all the other objects that we have, but it also exists in its own space. And that is because the computer needs to be able to calculate what this box looks like and where all its points are located. And if you were to rotate world space, well, then you would rotate all those vertices and you would change the shape of the box, and we don't want that. So that's why the computer also keeps in mind that there is another space called local space or object space, which always stays oriented to the original origin of the the primitive. So there's sort of an original orientation that each primitive is created in, and that is what the program holds accountable, if that makes sense. That's what it does. So let me just check real quick how long I've been recording. I'm gonna take a break here soon. So just chop it up so it doesn't become too much. So that's object space and world space. Very important, especially when you start doing more advanced models and you start creating more geometry. It's good to be able to know that you can move objects, but also individual elements in different orientations. Because the same goes for when I, for instance, select an edge. And again, I can select edges by holding down right mouse button and selecting edge right here. You can see that this now also is oriented in local space, but if I hold down W and left mouse button, if I change it to world, now I can also just move it around in world space. Um, so yeah, very useful. So anyway, let's scale down our forearm right here and stick it in there a little bit like that. And now we've sort of created a rudimentary arm. Um, so I think I'm gonna pause here and break up the video because we've basically discussed everything there you need to know about the basics, about the move tool, the scale tool, and the rotate tool, and we're now gonna get into actually modeling new geometry onto our primitives. So I'll see you guys in a bit.